There's a quiet moment that happens in millions of American homes every single week. It's right after the paycheck hits. For a few seconds, things feel stable. Bills look manageable. Life feels under control. Then reality starts deducting. Rent, utilities, insurance, gas, groceries that somehow cost more every month without improving in quality. And just like that, the balance shrinks again. Not because of bad decisions, not because of reckless spending, but because the cost of existing has outpaced the ability to get ahead. This is the financial reality of the average American in 2026, not the version shown in headlines, but the one people live inside every day. The economy, on paper, looks healthy. Markets are strong. Employment numbers look solid. Inflation is described as cooling. Yet, financially, a massive portion of the population feels fragile. One unexpected expense away from stress, one disruption away from scrambling. That disconnect isn't emotional, it's structural. In 2026, stability is no longer automatic. It has to be actively defended. And for many households, there simply isn't enough margin left to do that. The modern American budget isn't built around growth anymore. It's built around containment, containing costs, containing risk, containing anxiety. Housing consumes a larger share of income than it did a decade ago. Transportation costs are higher. Insurance premiums rise quietly, year after year. Every category that can't be avoided keeps expanding. Meanwhile, income growth has been uneven. Some benefited greatly, many did not. This imbalance has reshaped how money behaves in real life. People aren't building cushions, they're managing pressure. They aren't planning far ahead, they're staying afloat. That shift changes everything. Savings become inconsistent. Long-term goals get delayed. Short-term solutions take over. Not because people don't care about the future, but because the present demands constant attention. This is why so many Americans feel behind even when they're employed, educated, and working full-time. The problem isn't effort, it's compression. The space between income and expenses, the margin that once allowed progress, has narrowed. And margin is the foundation of financial confidence. Margin turns a flat tire into an inconvenience instead of a crisis. Margin creates options. Margin makes planning possible. In 2026, margin is scarce, and scarcity changes behavior. Or people second-guess themselves. They compare outcomes instead of context. They assume they missed something. But comparison without context is misleading. Most financial benchmarks people measure themselves against are inflated by extremes at the top. A small group pulls the averages upward, creating a false sense of what normal looks like. The truth lives in the middle, and the middle is under pressure. This pressure explains why financial anxiety is widespread even during periods of economic growth. Growth doesn't reach everyone the same way. Asset owners experience it first. Wage earners feel it last, if at all. This creates two parallel realities. One where net worth rises on paper, another where monthly cash flow feels tighter than ever. Both exist at the same time, and most people live in the second one. And that doesn't mean progress is impossible, but it does mean expectations need to be recalibrated. The rules that worked in the past no longer apply cleanly to the present. Understanding where you actually stand, not emotionally, but statistically, is the first step toward regaining control. Not to chase some artificial standard of wealth, but to build resilience, to create margin, to move from fragile to stable. In the next sections, we'll break this down clearly. What financial stability actually looks like today, how Americans at different ages are positioned, why feeling behind doesn't always mean you are, and what matters more than income when it comes to long-term security. This isn't about hype, it's about clarity, and clarity changes how you move. To understand where you stand financially in 2026, you have to forget one thing immediately: averages. Averages blur reality. They soften extremes. They hide pressure. When people hear phrases like, The average American is doing fine. What they're really hearing is a number distorted by the top slice of the population. A small percentage with very high wealth pulls the average upward, and suddenly the middle looks healthier than it actually is. That's why the only number that matters is the median, the midpoint, half above it, half below it. That's where real life happens. And when you look at the median American household in 2026, the story becomes much sharper. Let's start with cash, not investments, not retirement accounts, not home equity, just money you can actually use. The typical American household does not have a deep pool of liquid cash. For many, savings exist, but they're thin. That means stability depends on nothing going wrong, and nothing going wrong is not a strategy. This lack of liquidity explains why financial stress is widespread even among people with decent incomes. It's not about how much you earn. It's about how much room you have. Room to absorb a shock. Room to say no. Room to wait instead of panic. Most households don't have that room. Now let's talk about age. And because expectations change, and often unfairly, as people get older. There's a common belief that by your 30s or 40s, you should feel settled. But in 2026, that timeline no longer reflects reality. Younger adults are starting later, not because they're irresponsible, but because the starting line moved. Education takes longer. Housing costs delay independence. Debt follows people into years where previous generations were already building momentum. For many in their 20s and early 30s, financial life is about foundation, not growth. That's not failure. It's context. By mid-career, the pressure shifts. This is where expectations rise and anxiety spikes. People look around and assume they should be further ahead. But when you zoom out, something becomes clear. A large portion of Americans in their 30s and 40s are not behind. They're simply navigating a narrower path than generations before them. Income may be higher in nominal terms, but fixed costs are heavier. Housing takes a larger slice. Healthcare is more expensive. Childcare costs rival tuition. The math doesn't leave much room. And that's where debt enters the picture. Not as a moral failure, but as a structural tool people use to keep life moving. Debt isn't evenly distributed. It peaks in midlife, exactly when people are expected to be at their most stable. Mortgages, student loans that never fully disappeared, car payments stretched longer than ever, credit cards filling the gaps. This combination creates a dangerous illusion. On paper, net worth might look positive. In reality, a cash flow feels tight. And cash flow is what determines how life feels day to day. This is why so many people feel stuck even while doing everything right. They're not moving backward, but they're not gaining altitude either. They're climbing with weight attached. Now let's address retirement, because this is where fear quietly builds. Ask people how they feel about retirement, and you'll hear the same response over and over: I'm not ready. That fear isn't irrational. The gap between what people think they need and what they've actually accumulated is wide. But here's the critical detail. Most discussions miss. Retirement readiness isn't binary. It's not ready or doomed. It's a spectrum. And many people are closer to the middle of that spectrum than they realize, even if they're far from ideal. And the problem is that the benchmarks people compare themselves to are unrealistic. They're built on assumptions from a different era: cheaper housing, stronger pensions, lower healthcare costs, more predictable careers. In 2026, flexibility has replaced certainty. That doesn't make planning impossible, but it does require a different mindset. The real risk isn't being below some inflated benchmark. The real risk is not understanding your actual position. Because without that clarity, people either panic or disengage completely. Both are harmful. Now let's talk about behavior, because this is where the data gets interesting. Despite popular stereotypes, most Americans are not careless with money. They're cautious, They track expenses, they delay purchases, they compare prices. But caution alone doesn't generate progress when fixed costs dominate the budget. When most of your income is spoken for before it arrives, discipline becomes defensive instead of productive. You're not building wealth, you're holding the line. That's why savings rates remain low even among people who understand the importance of saving. It's not ignorance, it's trade-offs. Save for the future, or stabilize the present. In many households, there's no room to do both consistently. This leads to a quiet psychological shift. People stop aiming for growth and start aiming for survival with dignity. That may not sound dramatic, but it's a profound change in how a society relates to money. It explains why so many Americans feel exhausted by finances even when they're not in crisis. They're constantly managing risk. Now here's the part that often gets overlooked. Feeling behind does not always mean you are behind. In a compressed system, progress looks smaller, even when it's real. Reducing debt counts, stabilizing cash flow counts, avoiding financial backslides counts. These wins don't show up in flashy charts, but they change trajectories. And this is where comparison becomes dangerous. When you compare yourself to people who benefited from timing, inheritance, or asset booms, you're not measuring skill or effort, you're measuring exposure. Different starting points, different conditions. That comparison leads to unnecessary shame, and shame leads to poor decisions. The truth is simpler and more grounded. Most Americans in 2026 are not failing. They are operating inside a system with thinner margins, higher stakes, and fewer safety nets. Understanding that reality doesn't excuse poor choices, but it does eliminate false guilt. And once guilt is gone, strategy becomes possible. In the next part, we're going to get even more specific. We'll break down how cash flow matters more than net worth in daily life, why liquidity beats raw income, how people quietly move from fragile to stable, and what actually creates long-term momentum in this environment. Not shortcuts, not hype, just clarity, leverage, and control. If there's one mistake people make when judging their financial health, it's this. They focus on how much they have instead of how money actually moves through their life. Net worth sounds impressive. Income sounds impressive. Assets sound impressive. But none of those determine how your life feels on a random Tuesday. Cash flow does. Cash flow is the difference between breathing and holding your breath, between confidence and anxiety, between options and urgency. And in 2026, cash flow is where most Americans are quietly struggling. Here's the reality most people don't articulate. A household can look stable on paper and still feel financially fragile every single month. Why? Because fixed costs have taken control of the budget. Rent or mortgage payments lock in first. Insurance premiums don't negotiate. Utilities don't wait. Debt payments don't pause when life gets complicated. By the time income arrives, much of it is already assigned. This leaves very little discretionary space and almost no margin for error. That margin is the invisible line between stability and stress. And for many Americans, that line is razor thin. Now let's talk about debt, because this is where the pressure compounds. Debt isn't inherently bad. It's a tool, but tools become dangerous when they're used for survival instead of leverage. In 2026, a large portion of household debt exists not to build wealth, but to maintain normal life. That's a critical distinction. Mortgages dominate balances, and that's expected. But layered on top are car loans, education debt, and revolving credit. Each one alone may feel manageable. Together, they quietly consume flexibility. Debt changes how income behaves. Instead of income creating opportunity, it creates obligation. Every dollar earned already has a job, and most of those jobs don't benefit the future. This is why many people feel like they're running in place. Now, they're not falling behind dramatically, but they're not advancing either. They're servicing the past, and servicing the past limits the future. Nowhere is this more visible than with revolving credit. Credit cards are often described as convenience tools. In practice, they've become shock absorbers for households with limited margin. When expenses spike, credit absorbs the impact. Groceries run high, charge it. Unexpected bill, charge it. Gap between paychecks, charge it. This isn't about indulgence. It's about smoothing volatility. The problem is that smoothing volatility with high-interest debt turns temporary pressure into long-term drag. Interest compounds quietly. It doesn't scream. It erodes. Month after month, a portion of income is redirected away from progress and toward maintenance. And because minimum payments are designed to feel manageable, the cost is underestimated. What looks like flexibility becomes a slow leak. Now add psychology to the equation. When people feel financially stressed, decision-making changes. They prioritize speed over optimization, relief over efficiency, short-term calm over long-term positioning. That's not weakness. It's human behavior under pressure. This is why telling people to just budget better misses the point. Budgeting works best when there's margin to work with. When margin disappears, budgeting becomes defensive. You're not allocating surplus, you're rationing scarcity. That distinction matters. Now let's zoom in on housing, because this is the largest pressure point for most households. Housing costs don't just take money, they shape behavior. And high housing costs reduce mobility. They delay savings. They lock people into decisions longer than planned. Renters feel it as instability. Homeowners feel it as immobility. Either way, flexibility declines. For renters, rising costs eat into future plans. For homeowners, higher interest rates trap people in place. Selling no longer feels like an option. Moving becomes too expensive. Opportunity shrinks. This creates a paradox. People may appear wealthier on paper due to rising property values, yet feel poorer in daily life due to rising expenses. Equity grows, liquidity doesn't, and liquidity is what pays the bills. This is one of the defining features of the modern American financial experience: paper wealth without usable freedom. That disconnect explains a lot of frustration. If people feel like they should be doing better, because the numbers say they are. But those numbers can't be spent without consequences, so stress remains. Now let's talk about why this feels worse than before, even if incomes are higher. The answer is volatility. Life has become less predictable. Costs fluctuate, rates change, policies shift. Predictability used to be a hidden asset. When expenses were stable and careers were linear, people could plan. In 2026, planning requires assumptions, and assumptions feel risky. That uncertainty forces households to stay defensive. They hold cash when they can. They delay decisions. They hesitate to commit. This slows momentum. And without momentum, financial confidence erodes. Now here's the critical insight. Most Americans are not in financial freefall. And they're in financial tension. They're balancing competing priorities in an environment that offers little slack. Understanding that tension is key, because once you see it clearly, the narrative changes. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "Where is the pressure actually coming from?" That shift matters. It replaces shame with strategy. It allows realistic decisions instead of emotional reactions, and it highlights the most important lever available in this environment: control over cash flow. Not income alone, not net worth alone. Cash flow. The direction money moves each month determines trajectory more than any headline number. In the next part, we're going to focus on exactly that: how some households quietly move from fragile to stable without massive income jumps, how margin is rebuilt inch by inch, and how progress looks different in a compressed economy. Not flashy, not instant, but real. There is a difference between being broke and being fragile. Most Americans in 2026 are not broke. They're fragile. They can pay their bills. They can keep things moving. They can function, but only if nothing goes wrong. Fragility isn't about income level. It's about how many things can break before your finances do, and that's the line most people are standing on right now. One surprise expense, one missed paycheck, one rate increase, one medical issue, that's all it takes. This is why so many people feel constantly on edge, even when life looks fine from the outside. They're not unstable, they're unsupported. The system no longer absorbs shocks for households. Households absorb shocks for the system. That reversal is the defining feature of modern American finance. In the past, progress felt cumulative. You worked, you earned more, you saved, you moved forward. In 2026, progress feels conditional. You work, you earn, you stabilize, you wait. Stability has replaced momentum. And while that may sound discouraging, and it also reveals something important, the goalpost has shifted. The new win isn't explosive growth, it's resilience. Resilience means fewer emergencies turn into crises. Resilience means fewer decisions are made in panic. Resilience means time becomes an asset again. And resilience is built differently than wealth. It doesn't start with big numbers. It starts with margin. Margin is the space between what you earn and what you need. Even a small margin changes behavior. It allows patience. It allows planning. It allows restraint. Without margin, every decision is urgent, and urgency is expensive. Now here's the part most financial advice ignores. You don't rebuild margin by thinking bigger. You rebuild it by thinking narrower. In a compressed economy, broad goals overwhelm. See, get rich, maximize returns, optimize everything. Those ideas sound good, but they're abstract. What actually works is boring and precise. Reduce volatility, shorten feedback loops, stabilize cash flow. This is why some households quietly regain control while others remain stuck, even at similar income levels. They focus on reducing fragility before chasing growth. They eliminate the most expensive forms of instability first: high-interest debt, unpredictable expenses, commitments that offer no flexibility, not all at once, not dramatically, incrementally. This doesn't show up on social media, it doesn't feel exciting, but it works. Because once fragility declines, options increase. And options are the real form of wealth in 2026. Options to wait. Options to say no. And options to choose timing instead of reacting to pressure. This is where many people get stuck mentally. They believe progress only counts if it looks impressive. But in this environment, quiet progress compounds faster than loud ambition. Paying down one high-interest balance doesn't feel life-changing until it frees up cash every month. Building a small emergency fund doesn't feel powerful until it prevents a bad decision. Stability builds invisibly until suddenly it's there. Now let's address something important. Comparison is unavoidable, but comparison without context is destructive. When you compare yourself to people who benefited from different timing, different markets, or different starting points, you're not measuring discipline or intelligence. You're measuring exposure. Exposure to asset booms, exposure to cheap debt, exposure to opportunity. That's not a fair contest, and it leads people to take unnecessary risks trying to catch up. In 2026, catching up is the wrong goal. Staying solvent is winning. Staying flexible is winning. Staying stable is winning. This doesn't mean ambition disappears. It means ambition gets smarter. Instead of chasing upside first, resilient households protect downside. They build floors before ceilings. They prioritize survivability. Because once survivability is secured, growth becomes optional instead of desperate. And desperation is what destroys financial lives. This is the mental shift most people haven't made yet. They're still judging themselves by outdated standards. Standards from a time when housing was cheaper debt, was less aggressive, careers were more predictable, safety nets were stronger. Those standards don't apply cleanly anymore. Holding yourself to them creates unnecessary shame, and shame creates bad decisions. Clarity removes shame. Once you understand that the environment changed, strategy changes too. You stop asking, "Why am I behind?" and start asking, "Where can I reduce pressure?" That question leads to action. Small, targeted, sustainable action. And that's how people quietly move forward in 2026. Not by winning the economy, but by outlasting it. In the final part, we're going to bring everything together. We'll answer the core question clearly. Where do you actually stand? And what does ahead even mean anymore? We'll redefine success for this era. But we'll separate illusion from reality, and we'll close the loop between understanding and control. No hype, no shortcuts, just truth, direction, and agency. So where does all of this leave you? After the numbers, after the pressure, after the reality of rising costs, shrinking margins, and constant uncertainty. Where do you actually stand? Here's the honest answer most people never hear. You're probably not as behind as you feel, and the finish line you're chasing may no longer exist. The biggest mistake Americans make in 2026 isn't financial, it's psychological. They're measuring themselves against a version of success built for a different economy. An economy with cheaper housing, an economy with stable careers, an economy where time alone created progress. That economy is gone. And judging yourself by its standards guarantees disappointment. In this economy, being ahead doesn't mean having the biggest numbers. It means having control. Control over your cash flow, control over your reactions, control over how much chaos your finances can absorb. That's the real divide in 2026. Not rich versus poor, stable versus fragile. If you can handle an unexpected expense without panic, you're ahead of the curve. If you can go a month without using credit to survive, you're ahead. If your finances give you time to think, instead of forcing you to react, you're ahead. These wins don't show up in headlines, but they shape lives. The truth is, most Americans are navigating a financial environment that punishes volatility and rewards resilience. And resilience is built quietly. It's built when you choose stability over image, when you reduce pressure instead of chasing status, when you stop comparing outcomes and start comparing conditions. This doesn't mean giving up ambition. It means aiming ambition at the right target, not at looking wealthy, not at keeping up, but at building a system that works for you. A system where your money serves your life, not the other way around. Progress in 2026 is incremental. It's boring, it's slow, and it's real. It looks like fewer emergencies turning into crises. It looks like breathing room. It looks like sleeping better at night. That's not failure. That's adaptation. And adaptation is how people win in changed environments. The economy will continue to shift. Costs will continue to fluctuate. Headlines will continue to conflict with lived experience. But clarity cuts through all of that. Once you understand the game you're actually playing, comparison loses its power. You stop chasing illusions. You stop feeling late. You stop blaming yourself for structural problems. And that's where momentum begins. Not explosive momentum, sustainable momentum. The kind that compounds quietly over time. So when you ask yourself, where do I stand? Don't look outward first. Look at your margin. Look at your flexibility. Look at your ability to absorb stress without breaking. If those things are improving, even slowly, you're moving forward. And in 2026, moving forward is enough. Not because it's easy, but because it's real. This isn't the financial life we were promised, but it's the one we have. And understanding it, clearly, honestly, and without illusion, is the first step toward mastering it. A final message for Americans in 2026. Most Americans aren't bad with money in 2026. They're under pressure. Rising costs, shrinking margins, and constant uncertainty have changed the game. If you feel like you're working harder but moving slower, you're not failing. The rules changed. Stability is the new success. Breathing room is real wealth. And if you're still standing, adapting, and moving forward, you're doing better than you think.